Hey folks, I'm Will Jarvis. Along with my dad, Dr. David Jarvis, I host the podcast Narratives. Narratives is a project exploring the ways in which the world is better than it has been, the ways it is worse, and the paths toward making a better, more definite future. I hope you enjoy it. So today we've got Brendan Cooley, and I wanted to have Brendan on because Brendan, you taught a class when you were a senior, I want to say. Is that correct? And
I was senior, yes.
I was a sophomore at the time, and it was back in 2013, 2014, and the class was focused on the conflict between China and the U.S. and how it would develop in the future, and using game theory and things of that nature to kind of to look at the problem. And I thought that was really interesting because it became such a big topic later. And I really like to talk to people that are right about things in the future. And, I know you were right about that. So I think that you got to earn some points for that. And so do you mind giving us a brief bio? What did you do after that class, and your interest in international relations and how you got there?
Yeah, so that was 2014.
2014,
I guess. Will very patiently sat through a class taught by an undergraduate, which was a learning experience on all ends. So I went on from there. I worked for a defense policy think tank for a year, studying the defense policy sides of the U.S.-China conflict and thinking about kind of strategic planning for military posture for the United States in the Pacific, and then went to grad school. Spent 5+ years, just finished getting my PhD in politics at Princeton, and wrote a dissertation about a rather theoretical dissertation about trade and war, but with U.S.-China conflict applications kind of sitting in the background the whole time. And so I graduated in the fall and ended up punting on the international relations career and deciding that I was going to pursue my true passion of doing baseball analytics. So that's what I'm doing right now.
I love it.
But we'll talk about international relations today, and always love to have these conversations.
That's awesome. So I wanted to get started. What is the Perry expedition, and what lessons can we learn from it in regards to trade and war?
So the Perry expedition was an encounter between the United States and Japan in the 1850s. I don't know nearly as much about it as I would like to. The history actually seems fairly scant. So if any of your listeners have reading recommendations, I'd love to hear them. But the long story short is that Japan was basically fully autarkic at the time. It didn't trade with anybody in the outside world. The United States wanted to change that, and sent a small detachment of warships. This was at the beginning of the era of steam.
Gotcha.
Out to Japan to essentially demand that the government open to trade with the United States. And so Japan sort of saw these high-tech gunboats sitting out on the harbor and recognized that it had very little power to resist American demands. And so the encounter ended with an agreement that Japan would begin opening its markets to world trade and would provide various services to the United States in terms of coaling stations and stuff like that. And so I've paid some attention to this historical tidbit because I think it's an interesting, it sheds light on a lot of the sort of political dynamics of trade,
right,
that we don't pay attention to as much. It's interestingly not a war, but war was certainly on the table. And if the United States did not get what it wanted, it was very clear that that Commodore Perry had permission to engage in hostilities with Japan. But it shows that the threat of war actually affected the trade relations of the United States and Japan with the rest of the world in the time thereafter. So Japan became more open to trade than it otherwise would have been due to the coercive threats of the United States. And the other thing that's interesting is that the United States had no designs on Japan's territory, and that the sort of like the stakes of the conflict were entirely about trade. So what the United States wanted to get from Japan was not some piece of land, or didn't really want to extort like money or concessions or you know what your typical kind of historical bounty out of Japan. It wanted to change its trade policy. So in this sense, you see that both war affects trade, but also trade policy can define the stakes of potential conflicts. And so that's like a kind of core just observation about the history of trade and war that I use to motivate a lot of my work. But you see this dynamic in a lot of other places. So I just think the Perry expeditions are sort of a particularly clear instance in which the stakes of the conflict were clear, and we really see how the threat of war changed trading relations between Japan and the rest of the world.
That's interesting. So instead of Millard Fillmore, instead of wanting to go and conquer the island chain of Japan, it was, we want to go and we want to sell our stuff to the Japanese people
and
open up a new market.
Things. Exactly.
And buy Japanese things. That's interesting. Right. So was this driven by business interest, or was it like, is it clear what they were thinking, or is that even important at all? Just that the state actor wants to open up this kind of trading relationship.
Yeah, there's a really interesting family of historians called the Wisconsin School, and I think the core book is called The Tragedy of American Diplomacy.
Oh yeah.
That basically I think that's right. It basically tells the entire, like the story of U.S. foreign policy from before the Civil War and through the Cold War as a story of business interests essentially seeking market access abroad.
Interesting.
And so I don't know this history as well as I'd like to, but there are lots of cases in which you see businesses lobbying for a lot of these foreign policy actions that the United States military undertook. And so the connection between the individuals and business interests that stood to benefit from the foreign policy and the foreign policy actions that were undertaken are sort of very clear.
That makes sense. So it seems to be, kind of a commonly held belief that states that are more economically integrated are more peaceful. And I remember I had a class at UNC, it was a political science class, and it was on the European Union. And that was one of the core tenets. It was this idea, everyone came together in Europe and they wanted to build this community. And the idea was that, you've got this pyramid and you've got free movement of people, free movement of goods, and, aligning regulation to make that possible. And if you bring that all together, with lessen the likelihood that states would be in conflict with each other. Do you think that's true? What's wrong with that? Is there anything wrong with that?
I don't think it's wrong. I think economic intercourse is generally good for peace for a lot of the reasons that people posit. I mean, it's costly to disrupt ties. I mean, you only need to look as far as Brexit to see that disrupting trading relations, whether it be through some domestic political shock or through some international war, is not something that people like. It's not a event that people like to go through.
Right.
But I think the question that's left sort of unaddressed by that perspective is why do states choose to integrate their economies in the first place?
Got it.
And so, like, looking at the European Union, up until World War II, the economies of Europe were fragmented by all sorts of different trade barriers. It was very difficult to move goods across international borders, and there were tariffs and quotas and everything, and countries fought about these all the time.
Interesting.
And when the European community was founded, it was revolutionary in the sense that everyone sort of agreed to treat foreign goods the same way that they treated domestic goods.
Got it.
And I think it's that orientation toward protectionism, or the country's desire to integrate economically, that is the thing that's causing peace, rather than the trading relations themselves.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. So it seems like we've had kind of this bull run of opening more open trading relationships between countries, and it seems like everything's quickly sliding backwards. Do you feel this is? It seems to be a real phenomenon. Do you see this continuing or reversing? What do you think?
Yeah, and it bears out in the data that trade the pace of trade expansion has contracted quite a bit in the past several years. Yeah, I hope it doesn't continue. I'm not particularly optimistic. I think the West is very much feeling the rapidity of economic integration has affected the politics of the West, sort of in a way that makes the governments in Europe and the United States and Japan more protectionist than they would otherwise be. I think a lot of that has to do with how quickly China has grown and how quickly it's disrupted global trading markets, and it's made it very difficult for people who were who essentially have felt the adverse effects of globalization to cope. And right. I think that's being manifested in the political changes that you've seen in the last several years.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I remember taking an econ class, talking a lot about Carolina today, and we were talking about free trade, and it was and one of the the professor goes up there and he's like, well, like, yes, there are trade-offs and that some people may lose their jobs, but they can just always go and retrain. But I think the truth is we're generally asking the people that are least able to retrain. And also, if let's say if you're working in West Virginia in a coal mine, you don't want to retrain to be a home health worker. Yes. It's much lower status position, et cetera. And it's and then we see all these deaths of despair and all these other second order phenomenon. And it seems like the trade-offs were, it costs a lot more than we expected, so to speak. And it's like the hollowing out of middle America. I give this example. If you're in Palo Alto, if you're in like Chapel Hill, things look like really awesome. Like the people, they look healthy, like the buildings are really well taken care of. But you go out into Eastern North Carolina and like you go past these like abandoned textile mills and things of that nature. Yep. And things like they look completely different. Looks like a completely different country. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that?
And it's very difficult. And because of the way that, because of how expensive the cities that have sort of benefited from globalization have become, it's very difficult for people even to move, even if they wanted to.
Great point.
Their ability to sort of move to opportunity is compromised, and then there are immense economic, those are economic costs, but there are obviously social costs as well, in that like these folks' families and communities are rooted in a particular place, and to leave is something that very few people want to do.
Right.
And this is all sort of, all of this is, we have fairly good evidence is connected to the intensification of trade ties with China in particular, but globalization in general.
That's interesting. So knowing all that, what's a policymaker to do, if that makes sense, especially in relation to trade with, let's say, China has been the big example in the last 4 years. Is it escalating tariffs? Is it de-escalating tariffs? Is it trying to negotiate better deals? What does that look like? I don't know.
Yeah, there are lots of different dimensions of the problem. To go back to the economic dislocation question, I think one of the biggest things you can do is make it easier on people who are adversely affected by trade. I think our transfer programs to help people who have been hurt by globalization are fairly insufficient, and not. both insufficient and ineffective in terms of getting money in the hands of the people that need it in order to do the kind of retraining or relocation or just being able to live in the place and the job that they currently occupy. That's something that I think would help the internal politics of the Western countries quite a bit, and would make them more resilient in the face of some of the external challenges. But then you still have to deal with the sort of the flip side of the coin, which is that not only are you dealing with this internal economic and political dislocation, but you have this foreign policy or this foreign economic policy challenge in that China has not fully reciprocated the market access that it's been given by the West, and still protects a lot of key sectors and uses all sorts of regulations to keep Western competition out, which is bad for Western firms and for workers alike. And so that's a whole nother can of worms.
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't have good solutions to the problem. I think that basically, like, I hear arguments on all sides of the coin and see merit in all of them. I think since China's ascension to the World Trade Organization in the early 2000s, the amount of that essentially, the West was hoping that China's political liberalization would follow its economic liberalization.
They thought it was,
and it's been almost 20 years, right?
Right.
And
once you get to that purchasing power parity, it just flips over. You just automatically democracy. That seems to be like that was the commonly held belief. It seems like,
and we're not there, right?
Right.
We're not. It doesn't seem like we're close.
Yeah, it seems like we're getting farther away. In fact, Xi is now president for life, and I don't know.
And so I think you look at that and you say, well, this plan that the West, broadly defined, had for how to integrate China into the world economy, that economic integration would precede political liberalization, seemed to fail. And if that's the case, then the sort of core assumption of the strategy no longer holds. So I think some sort of rethinking is merited. The question is sort of what you do now,
right?
And I think it's a hard question, because despite all of the economic dislocation that we were talking about before, there have been immense benefits to both, poor Chinese who have been, just dramatically lifted out of poverty, and to consumers in the West who can now purchase basically any consumer good for prices that were unbelievable 20 years ago, right? Which matters. It's not just cheap stuff. It matters for people's livelihoods and their ability to kind of realize the life that they want. So I think they're just sort of costs and benefits abound, and it's really difficult to think about how you reset the relationship when it seems like, regardless of the path that you take, there are sort of nasty consequences, right?
The real trade-offs, no matter wherever you look.
Yeah,
that's interesting. How important do you think things like industrial policy, like having equipment, building things here is? I want to give you the example. So my sister works at Thermo Fisher, and she works at the only vaccine filling. It may not be the vaccine filling, but it's a central part of vaccine production. It's the only plant that does it in the U.S. is in Greenville, North Carolina. Like, there's one plant, and there's like a couple thousand people that work there, but that is the only plant, and everything else is in China. Like, so the entire U.S. There's now only one place that, and it's because it's in Eastern North Carolina, labor is relatively cheap compared to the rest of the country. Is that something we should be worried about? I remember, in a lot of philosophy classes, like, don't worry about that. That's just like a very tail end risk kind of thing to worry about. But we see that with PPE too, right? We didn't have enough PPE. We couldn't get it from anywhere, and we couldn't produce it here. It seems like a real problem. I don't know.
Yeah, I think there are cases in which, I mean, it's easy to imagine being exploited by these sorts of trade dependencies, and
Right.
I'll recommend to listeners Hirschman's book. Oh, gee, I'm going to forget the title on the spot. But it's a classic sort of study of trade as a weapon, essentially. Sort of how do you use trade dependency in order to exploit other countries and sort of use that to your own benefit. And he sort of studies the example of Germany in the interwar period, sort of being able to bully Eastern Europe by being such an essential trading partner, essentially. And so I can see these sorts of dependencies being push points where you could imagine the country being exploited. At the same time, the United States is such an enormous and important market for so many things in the world that it also has these sorts of pressure points on other countries. And I think when leaders sort of start to go down the road about thinking whether or not they want to use these weapons, they think twice and recognize that it's very easy for others to turn turn it around and exploit them the same way. So that's not one of my chief concerns. But I worry more about it in the realm of sort of military technology and things like that. And it does seem like policymakers have paid a fair deal of attention to that and are thinking about it and trying to build resiliency in those areas.
Interesting. It does seem like they've been paying more attention to it. I know, was it last year they had a Harvard scientist they arrested and put in federal prison for sharing secrets in Wuhan, actually, with a joint appointment. They were paying for his house or something, and it does seem like people are paying more attention to that. So that's a great segue to in the coming conflict and current conflict with China. I see two dominant narratives. One is China's so far ahead, there's nothing we can do, and China's so far behind, there's nothing we need to do. And neither seems to be really the case. What do you think the current state is, and how do you think it will develop? I know that's a difficult question.
In terms of sort of the U.S.-Chinese sort of international political influence, or
that's right,
economic might, or kind of well-being.
That's a good. So I guess positional power is like a global hegemon, if that makes sense. Is it just going to be kind of a bipolar world for a while? Or I know Peter, is it Zihan is just convinced that China's not really a real player to worry about. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that I don't have particularly strong positions either way, but I think the fact is that the United States and China are going to become decoupled economically over the next decade or so. I think if I would bet on the incoming administration, or perhaps when folks are listening to this, it will be the current administration, will be fairly successful in convincing the European Union and the UK and Japan to go along with the United States in terms of this sort of decoupling, or at least sort of dramatically scaling down the amount of interconnectedness with China. And I think that's going to push the Chinese to invest strongly in economic and political ties with other countries. And I think that's going to look in practice like more like traditional spheres of influence
Got
than
it.
we're used to seeing in the 20th century, that there will sort of be a China-centric trading bloc and a alternative Western-centric trading bloc, and there will be supporting political military structures around those blocks. I don't think that's good for anybody.
Right.
But I think that's probably where we're headed. I mean, the United States has the advantage of this in terms of being the appealing partner to the majority of the world's largest economies.
Got it.
But that being said, it's not a good outcome for either side.
Right. That makes sense. So does it look like more Belt and Road kind of initiatives and development in Africa, or that kind of
Yeah,
thing?
I mean, I like, my senses were, in some ways that a lot of the investment in Africa and in Central Asia through Belt and Road and stuff like that is sort of laying the foundations for this kind of political realignment. Southeast Asia is already very well integrated with the Chinese economy, and it'll be interesting to see where they turn. There's a lot of division within ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Countries, about sort of how closely they would like to be connected with China. But the fact is that they're extremely dependent on China economically, and it's hard to imagine them extricating themselves from that. So I think in that sense, we're seeing a kind of like a resurgence of the non-aligned world, and that's going to be who the West and China are sort of competing for influence over.
That makes a lot of sense. I wanted to ask you. You mentioned you worked at a defense think tank for a little bit, and thought about some of the issues in the Pacific. And I just recently finished a book by Christian Bros called "The Kill Chain." And the central thesis was, in the Pacific, the Chinese developed anti-ship missiles that render our carriers fairly useless. Have you read about this? Are you worried about this? Do you think it's a real threat?
Yeah, I mean, so the group I worked with thought a lot about this before it was popular, but it does seem like the sort of the defense establishment now recognizes that China is a sort of major technological threat, and has been doing a lot in terms of really changing the way that they think about investment in new platforms and military strategy. Yeah, I mean, the long and the short is that missiles are very cheap to
Right, that seems to be the real
procure.
problem.
They're increasingly accurate and able to seek targets over the horizon and revector as targets move. So an aircraft carrier is not safe. And in the sort of what they call the cost exchange ratio of these sorts of engagements is very unfavorable from the United States perspective, in that if you want to defend that carrier, you're thinking about sending a lot of many interceptors at these sorts of missiles, most of which will miss, and that's your best hope of sort of defending your position. So I think from a purely defense policy perspective, the Pentagon recognizes this and has been changing the way that they think about procuring new stuff in order to deal with it. But it does mean that it's much harder for the United States to pose a sort of, or to be credible when it says it's going to defend Taiwan or defend Japan, or counter Chinese influence in Southeast Asia, when the big, expensive, powerful platform that it sends to demonstrate that power is something that's actually very vulnerable.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. At least people are now thinking about the problem, right? That seems to be the first step to creating a kind of solution, right? Is to understand that it is a real issue. I was wondering, this is a bit of a shift, but could you steelman liberal international relations theory and then perhaps realism? I think they're kind of important concepts.
Yeah, and I think really important for thinking about the U.S. and China going forward. So these are sort of canonical international relations paradigms or theories. And so liberalism essentially is built around the premise that what's most important in international relations is what countries want or what governments want, and seeks to essentially explain variation in the tenor of countries' relations with one another. Sort of, are they allies or foes, or do they fight wars, do they trade, what have you? With respect, but by looking at differences in their interests. So if you want to explain why the U.S. and Europe get along and trade a lot with each other, you root your explanation in the domestic political institutions of those countries or organizations, or the economic interests in those countries, these sorts of things. So realism is the more classical theory of international relations, which thinks that states' interests are basically fixed, that governments either want to survive to see the next day, or alternatively want to dominate the world, depending on which brand of realism you ascribe to. But the sort of paradigm starts in the assumption that states all want the same thing. And in this sort of zero-sum, very conflictual world, what matters is power. And power determines who gets what and who survives and who's able to impose their will on others. So I think what's unfortunate about these paradigms in some sense is they're both obviously true. In that what countries want matters in determining what they do, and how powerful countries are also matters in determining whether they're able to achieve those ends. And as a discipline, international relations has not been nearly as successful in sort of taking those insights and integrating them into coherent, better, more formal theories as they are at arguing about whether liberalism or realism is better in some way.
That's right. It almost seems like, it's like you need your power to be able to exercise what you want in the world, right? Like,
exactly.
I don't know. So why do you think international relations has not been successful so far at kind of collating that? Is it just like kind of factional academic politics or something that prevents innovation from happening? Or
yeah, there's a lot of that. The incentives are bad because for a long time, people were able to publish papers and get tenure by picking fights with other people and
interesting.
and writing, screeds in the discipline's journals about why one person's theory is wrong and my theory is right, and you just go back and forth forever. I believe that like scientific progress in the discipline like really rests on being able to take those ideas and formalize them mathematically and then subject them to sort of rigorous empirical tests. And for a very long time, the discipline seemed reluctant to do that. In the 90s, to its credit, the field started to take a turn. And I think things have been much better since then. But that being said, there's still an awful lot of kind of squabbling and infighting along these lines, and less kind of like less teamwork in terms of like dedication towards building a theoretical apparatus that we can all agree on and all use and all kind of push the ball forward together. And so in that sense, I still think that the discipline is kind of trapped in a still almost pre-scientific kind of world, which is frustrating.
Yeah.
I sometimes analogize this to actually the field of international trade, which really dates itself back to Ricardo and
Right.
writing about cloth and wine and comparative advantage and very conceptual type things, and advances in trade were just kind of were words, and they were the ways to think about the competing visions about how the world works, and
Right.
Marx was in on that debate, and it was people exchanging just perspectives, right? But then eventually the field got to a point where they were able to sort of write down a model of how they thought trade worked, and that was the sort of that was the beginning of trade economics as a science.
Gotcha.
And in the sort of 90s and 2000s, they finally got to the point where they were able to take those theories and really marry them with data. And once they were able to do that, they have this sort of this core that everybody sort of ascribes to, this is what trade theory is, and this is what empirical work in trade economics looks like. And the discipline is extremely cumulative because of that. International relations is very, very, very far from that, which I think is unfortunate. But that's why we keep having these conversations and keep thinking about these things, and
right,
trying to move the ball forward.
That's right. I love that, because I was reading a couple of your papers, and there's there's a lot of notation, and you've also focused a lot on game theory, which I think is really interesting, providing real kind of theoretical and kind of creating a model you can look at, and everyone, it's subjective and everyone can look at it and poke at it, instead of just kind of talking around the subject. I don't know.
Yeah, and it doesn't, and it's not right. Right.
Right.
I mean,
right.
it's a representation
exactly.
of the world that has an enormous amount of assumptions, some of which are stated explicitly, but most of which are just kind of the fact that we think we can represent how humans
right.
how billions of humans interact across
right.
thousands of miles of space with a few equations is insane. But as humans, we're not going to be capable of doing anything more than that in our pea brains. So it seems if you want to build something that lasts and that is communicable to others, and something that's going to be that other people can build on in the future, it sort of has to be expressed in this common language that everybody can pick up and understand. So that it's not a particularly satisfying outlook, I guess, but I think it's the way you kind of it's the way you have to go forward in science.
Definitely, you have to have some kind of foundation to get
Right.
everybody on board, and then you can build up from that. But without that,
Right.
just talking in circles, I guess.
Yes.
That's really interesting. So my next question, it kind of it goes along these lines a bit. It's what does the layperson kind of most misunderstand about trade and war, and then conversely, what do the experts most misunderstand?
Yeah. So
and the experts is a bit broad. So is lay people,
yeah.
but
yeah. Well, what do you think lay people think about trade and war? What's the consensus now?
So I think that's a great question. Just on the trade policy side, and this is kind of I don't know, this is kind of an answer I think most people would say if you've taken a college econ class and just got out of it, would be that people understand it can be positive some, but trade and war, that's a good question. They may understand it slightly better than policymakers now. I think people had an intuitive sense that these two things are connected, on the ground, if that makes sense. Soybean farmers in the U.S. understand that this is very much a, this is, it's very closely related to power and policy and war all the time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think Um, I think the experts have come a long way. I think for a very long time, economists and maybe to a lesser extent political scientists just sort of screamed into the void that free trade is good and you all people need to just get on board the train.
Get on the board.
And we're definitely no longer there, which is good. So I think experts have a very good understanding of the sort of domestic distributional consequences of trade now. I think they've done less about understanding the sort of international distributive consequences of trade and sort of what that means for countries' international relations. That being said, within the last couple of years, there's been a lot of really great work in this area in political science and economics. So I think we're getting there, but I think it's harder because it really relies on understanding how the distributional consequences of trade sort of work domestically first, and then understanding how those get channeled into politics, and then how domestic politics really affects international politics. But I think experts are getting better at that. But I think you're right that like the body politic, for lack of a better word, has really for a long time recognized that trade is not just this or international trade is not just this sort of diffuse exchange kind of thing that that's positive sum or whatever, right? I mean, I think they recognize that that it's an intensely political thing, and there's some really interesting research that shows that sort of that Congress people from whose districts have been adversely affected by trade with China actually adopt more hawkish foreign policy positions towards China as well. And so I don't think that necessarily vindicates lay people per se, but I mean, it suggests that there's something in a sort of macro information aggregation kind of sense that's happening where certain individuals are recognizing that their welfare is affected by decisions being made abroad, because otherwise it's hard to explain how that connection would, or how that observation would sort of manifest.
Definitely. Yeah, it's a tough problem. It's a yeah, exactly. It's tough to get your kind of arms around because it's so complex.
Right.
So the next part, I wanted to kind of throw out a couple of terms, and just I want to know whether you think they're overrated, underrated. It's kind of this very interesting kind of a exercise. I got it from Tyler Cowen from Marginal Revolution. And so I'll just throw out a few terms, and maybe if you give a sentence or two, just why you think it's overrated or underrated or correctly rated.
Sure.
And I think I was thinking about this recently. Do you ever listen to Conversations with Tyler?
Absolutely.
So I feel like people should, if you believe the efficient market hypothesis, you should, in general, say things are correctly rated, right? But the vast majority of the time, unless you're just trying to throw out a hot take or something. But anyway, I think it's interesting. So overrated or underrated? Hobbes.
I'll say underrated. I think that a lot of people probably read Leviathan at some point.
Yeah.
In their sort of philosophy or political science or whatever, but probably more in philosophy than political science now. And I think it's kind of treated as a cute kind of
state of nature,
or it's treated as oh well, this is how things were back before we had enlightened government or whatever. And I think it's important to remind ourselves that the anarchy that Hobbes describes is kind of fundamental to all politics. Gotcha. that we're never really that far from that kind of world. I mean, you imagine if you just snapped your fingers and police in the United States went away, sort of what would happen, right? And that world conditions politics in so many different ways, and I think we forget that.
Right.
right? So underrated, long-winded, but underrated.
That's great. That's great. Malthus, overrated, underrated?
Oh boy. I'm not sure. So, I mean, like, do you have like you have Malthusianism in mind?
Yeah, sure. Like the
Um,
concept that, like, for his time, like we've got more people, you have more children, you just like there's less food, and then things
yeah,
slowly devolve. I like a model of the world. Like I almost feel like the Communist Party in China views the world extremely
right,
zero sum or negative, and
right.
so I don't, and I think that's always helped me kind of model their actions a little bit. I don't know.
I'll say overrated in the sense that I still you hear a lot in sort of discourse around climate change about how um, people ought to have fewer children because of their impact on the environment, which I
Right.
think is a
It's very common.
very
Very common.
wrong-headed idea. And so in that sense, Malthusianism is still with us, and overrated in the sense that people still seem to be giving it more credence than it deserves.
Yes. Antinatalism is strong throughout the society now. It seems
That's
like
right.
it's very
Yeah.
bad. So what about Cleodynamics? Kind of Peter Turchin trying to kind of it's similar to what you're talking about. Formal proofs, trying to model history with data and create a kind of a better process.
Yeah,
You think
so I don't know a ton about the field. My sense is that it's sort of adjacent to history.
it is? So you know, I just finished an Atlantic article on Peter Turchin. He worked on this very specific type of beetle, and then he moved to history. And he's like, "Wow, we've got to bring mathematics to history to try and create like a more rigorous process, and maybe we can find these general trends." And I don't
Uh-huh.
know.
So I imagine historians are not particularly friendly towards
They're
his
very
branch of
upset. There were
history.
quite a few
Yeah.
upset, historians in the article. Let me tell you.
Yeah, and I'll so for that I'll say underrated. Yeah, I mean I think it's historians' natural bent seems to be sort of that every case is unique and you can't that the generalization is bad. And I'll just cheerlead for for the political scientist in me and say that no generalization is good, and we ought to study these long-term trends and try to theorize them in a cohesive way.
That's great. That's great. So let's see. I had a few more questions here. So these are a little bit unrelated, but these are some questions I found just reading your work. So how difficult is it to build cohesive societies when you have a lot of ethnic heterogeneity? And are there any easy workarounds to try to build community with people? We see this in Rwanda now with Kagame has been well, some say dictator, some say he's done a really good job with kind of bringing the country together after the crisis in the
Yeah.
90s and the genocide. But
Yeah. I'm not sure. I mean, I've done a little bit of work on sort of ethnicity and trade. Um, I think it's hard to say um, because a lot of the ethnic heterogeneity that we observe or we see in the world, it is itself a function of politics.
gotcha.
I mean, just to like take an example close to home, like we no longer recognize a sort of salient political distinction between Irish Americans and Italian Americans.
Right. They all belong together
Um,
now.
right, but 50 years ago,
Very much
courting
did.
the Italian vote was a thing, right?
Right.
And similarly with the Irish
Columbus
vote,
Day.
right?
Columbus Day was an
E-
effort to go with the Italian vote.
exactly, exactly. Um, and so I think if you look at society, like if you look at societies that we consider to be ethnically fragmented, I mean, some people claim the United States is ethnically fragmented. Um, a lot of that is itself a function of divisive politics. Um, and so so I mean, one of the hurdles in building integrated societies is to have politics that are more inclusive and treat people as individuals and not members of some ethnic group. I mean, the classic, to take the Rwanda example, right? I mean, the sort of the distinction between Hutus and Tutsis is something that most people recognize to be sort of not based in anything, right? I mean, it's a fabrication, right? So in that sense, ethnic heterogeneity is sort of down the causal chain from political dysfunction. So in that sense, if you fix the politics first, then perhaps you have less ethnic fragmentation and more cohesive societies that way. But I mean, at the same time, I think the fact that people believe these ethnic differences to be salient means that they matter. I mean, in the United States, we recognize distinctions between people based on ethnicity. People claim to be of different groups, and that clearly matters politically. And so to that, like recognizing that that's a fact, I think you also want to build political institutions that are as broadly representative across those lines as you can be. And I think when we look at places that are ethnically fragmented, we often see that one group claims disproportionate political power and uses that to sort of entrench those ethnic lines and to claim more of the sort of government spoils for themselves. So I think it's a tight line to draw in that, like when you try to engage in that sort of nation building project, when you try to engage in that kind of spreading representation across ethnic groups, you're implicitly recognizing the importance of those ethnic groups, which which I don't think is particularly good. But at the same time, like if you recognize empirically that clearly they matter, I think you have to do something to address that. So I don't have any easy suggestions, but that's sort of how I think about the issue.
That reminds me, would you have any tips for, let's say, a policymaker that it seems like America's gotten much less good at rebuilding countries. So if you look at Japan and Germany, to World War II, crazy success stories. And then if you look at Iraq and Afghanistan, not so much. Have we just has the U.S. federal government just gotten worse at doing things in general, and this is just like a byproduct of that? Or
I mean, if I was gonna play Occam, I would say the Soviet Union went away.
Interesting.
I mean, I think a large part of the United States' ability to shape West Germany and Japan and other countries, and South Korea, Taiwan, lots of other places, the Philippines maybe to a less extent, to exert influence over them and to shape the trajectories of their governments and their economies was due to the fact that it had a credible threat to sort of throw them to the Soviets, which they didn't want.
Right.
And no such thing really exists in Iraq or Afghanistan. There are lots of other issues in those places that makes it hard to encourage sort of development of stable political institutions and functioning economies. Right. But I think that's one of the big reasons why the United States was so successful in the past, and it's maybe less so now.
That's really, really interesting to me. We talked on the podcast a lot about how and I haven't phrased it like this before, but I think it makes a lot of sense. You need kind of an existential threat to solve some of these collective action problems. Like, so people just, and if it doesn't exist, one of our previous guests was bemoaning the fact that COVID was not enough of an existential crisis to cause us to get off our rear ends. We had the Moderna vaccine. It was ready in March, but we had to wait for, a year because of Guillain-Barré with, what was it, the swine flu in the 80s, 1 in 100,000 people got Guillain-Barré, and now the public health establishment is afraid if we put out the vaccine too early, how many deaths are we willing to balance on this, scale just because we won't get the
It's
vaccine in?
nuts.
But, that's
Yep.
just one example, right? There's multiple,
Right.
failures at all levels. But it does seem like that is important, having some existential threat, which is, it's troubling to me because I would like to be able to solve these things without having some existential threat. But perhaps that's just not possible. I don't know.
Well, yeah, I mean, so maybe this is a silver lining of the China conversation that, a lot of places that were sort of, coasting in the sort of US-led post-Cold War,
Right.
Global era now will face a choice and may have to make some reforms that they were previously unwilling to undertake. And maybe you get good outcomes out of that. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons that China didn't politically liberalize the way that the United States and others had hoped was in part because the rest of the world didn't have enough leverage over it. I mean, China before ascension of the WTO looked a lot like the autocracies in South Korea and Taiwan did in the 50s and 60s. And those governments were sort of forced to politically and economically liberalize over time as a condition of retain the protection of the United States. And the US has no similar ability to coerce the PRC. I mean, nothing even close, right?
Interesting. So you just can't and it does seem weird because it was almost taken as fact by a ton of really smart people, it seems like. Just going back and reading that, like democracy 2015 China, it's happening, or it's gonna happen, but that has not been the case at all.
Yep.
Interesting. I had one more question if you had some time.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's slightly unrelated, but I've been thinking about it for a while. Are hot shooting wars between big powers just unthinkable now because of the weapons we have? They're so destructive. Is it all going to be like what happened in the Donbass in Ukraine, where it's like, you have the special forces going at night and little green men are running around and causing mayhem?
So I'm not sure. So all I know is they're not unthinkable in the sense that the United States government spends an awful lot of time thinking about hot non-nuclear war with China.
A ton of time.
And I know that the People's Liberation Army spends an equal, if more time thinking about a hot shooting non-nuclear war with the United States. And then none of these wars involve little green men or information ops or things that are plausibly deniable. They involve ballistic missiles being fired out across the Pacific Ocean, right?
God. Right.
So in that sense, it's not unthinkable. The question is, I think the real question is sort of how much of a deterrent is the sort of specter of world annihilation and nuclear war. I hope it's quite large, but it's not hard to sort of write down models in which countries that recognize that they are taking risks of world annihilation nevertheless choose to escalate and find themselves shooting nuclear weapons at each other. I mean, Thomas Schelling was writing about this in the 60s, and his work stands sort of like unchallenged today, right? So in that sense, it's perfectly thinkable.
Can you talk about Schelling a little bit before you continue? I think that might be interesting to the audience.
Yeah, I mean, I think the core, like one of the core insights that came out of his work is that sort of rational, forward-thinking, calculating states that recognize the cost of nuclear war might nevertheless take actions that run a positive risk of nuclear war, or at the end of the day might end up actually pushing the button. And so it's this sort of theory of brinkmanship, and sort of at the end of the day concludes that nuclear war is not something that is the sole province of psychos like Kim Jong-un, if you think he's a psycho, but I mean his actions are actually probably not inconsistent with a perfectly rational individual. And I mean, I think recognizing that is fundamental if you want to build institutions and norms that contribute to world peace. Because the problem then becomes not simply convincing people that nuclear war is very expensive and very bad, and sort of trying to get decision makers to overcome cognitive biases or whatever. You actually have to solve the problem that like rational, forward-thinking leaders might still find themselves in a situation where they want to use nuclear weapons. You have to design institutions that make them less likely to do so. So it's not a particularly sunny outlook on the situation, but I think it's really important for anybody that wants to think about how to sort of encourage peace between the United States and China going forward to understand.
It definitely is. And I am reminded, just thinking about this, that, states do have some ability to coordinate weapon use. So in World War II, chemical weapons were not used. And like there's some ability. I don't know. It's weird for me to think about that, just because the concept of war being like somewhat legalistic, in the sense that states that even when they're opposing each other, they can kind of coordinate on like, okay, these are the rules of the game, if that makes sense, which is very odd to think about in such a bad and
it's hard to like remember that when we were willing to use nuclear weapons in World War II. I mean, obviously part of that was that the United States had a monopoly at the time, but yeah, so I guess you can cross your fingers and hope that we have a taboo on nuclear weapons going forward. It's quite possible that we do, but taboos get broken,
right? Exactly.
And so I wouldn't want to hang my hat on that taboo sticking.
Definitely, that's quite worrisome. Well, Brendan, thank you so much for coming on. Is there any other reading materials we should send people to? Just your website? I can put some links in the show notes.
Yeah, sure. Check out. I mean, feel free to go to my website and pull my papers up, but go straight to the bibliography and find some of the great history books that I put in there. I can send you the Tragedy of American Diplomacy link, and maybe some of the other books that I mentioned, and we can post those up.
That'd be great. All right. Any parting shots?
No, this is great. Thanks for having me, Will.
Absolutely. It was great chatting with you.
Thanks.
Well, that's our show for today. I'm Will Jarvis.
And I'm Will's dad.
Join us next week for more narratives.